Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Francesca and this is our first event of 2021 for Authors North, our Meet the Publisher session. It's so lovely to see so many people here and loads of northern places in the chat. Today we're joined by Genevieve Pegg, Publishing Director, and Alice Murphy-Pyle, Head of Marketing at HarperNorth. HarperNorth's a new Manchester-based outpost of HarperCollins and was established in 2020. They're on the lookout for fiction, non-fiction from northern writers. Jen and Alice will talk to us for about 20 minutes or so about what they do, what makes a good submission and what they're looking for and they're most excited about in 2021. I'll then pop back on screen at the end of that for some questions. Some of you have sent them in advance, so thanks for that, but please do post them in the chat on the side and we'll get through as many as we can. We'll finish for sort of 4:15ish and then take a 5-minute comfort break before we all move over to Zoom for everyone to have an informal chat with one another in small breakout rooms. So we'll post the link to the Zoom in the chat, which is separate from this session because there's so many of you, we didn't want it to be so unwieldy on Zoom. We'll finish the whole thing for around 5 p.m. Just a reminder that if you do have kind of connection problems during the session, try clicking the reconnect button at the top. Or you can rejoin the session using the link that was emailed to you. We are recording this session, so don't worry if you miss anything, we'll email the link round to everybody. I'll disappear now and hand over to Jen and Alice. Thanks so much.
Smashing. Well, thank you, first of all, for having us here. I think all of us could probably come up with a list as long as our arm of things we're missing in lockdown. But as publishers, I think probably really high up on that list of things that we wish we were doing now is getting out and about, being in libraries, being in bookshops and hanging out with our writers and just being able to talk books, talk stories, talk ideas. So while we are all closeted away in our various bunkers and living rooms and back rooms, this sort of virtual platform is fantastic. And it's something that I'm really grateful for because I think we've learned a lot that we'll keep with us as we go forward, as we get out and about back in the world. We'll keep this digital way of being able to meet up with people, for people who can't get around so much, for getting that big sort of geographical diversity. But I also wanted to say thank you, first of all, to all the writers out there, because I think as a piece of the arts sector, I have been acutely aware over this last year of how lucky we are compared to so many of our friends and colleagues in theatre, in live music. And thanks to you, we're incredibly lucky that we have a business that involves solo talent creating these wonderful books and solo consumers in the reader. And those, for us, we know as publishers, we're the glue between writers and readers. And the fact that we've been able to carry on that process through lockdown has been a privilege, really, and something that has gone a long way towards keeping some kind of sanity through the journey of last year. And so, yeah, I think that's what, despite everything that we've all faced in January, that's how I start this year, is feeling lucky. Lucky not just that we get to do what we do and spend our time with these amazing voices, but also that as HarperNorth, we're the new kid on the block, and we get to be spending most of our time buying books for, 2022, some for even 2023. We've had the greatest fun finding some fantastic books for this autumn, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And thinking about a world that will hopefully be some kind of new normal. And when we publish some of our titles, we might be able to actually have a book launch in person or some other great old-fashioned joy like that. But today, when we were speaking to Francesca about what might be helpful, we talked a little bit about saying why we were here. And I'm hoping I'm speaking to lots of people who will recognise something that was a very deep-seated feeling in me that, as a tiny nation that we are compared to so many other countries across the world, we're still a dense and a diverse one, but one that sometimes threatens to overbalance with that the weight that our capital city can carry in our media and presents us as a far more London-centric nation than we are. And because of that, there's been that historic gap between the incredible creativity of the North and the number of people that get published, the titles, the stories that get out onto those national stages. And we wanted to be here to bridge that divide. One thing we're certainly not here to do is pretend that there wasn't already an amazing art scene in the North. And when we set up HarperNorth, it was very much to join that community, that creative community, and celebrate some of the amazing work being done already. We know, of course, there's so many amazing writers coming out of here, but also that crop of really sort of vibrant and talented indies doing some really innovative publishing. But we know as well that there are still more stories to tell. And I think that was something that most of us as sort of founding members felt really passionately, that when you sit in a boardroom in a London publisher, it's very easy to talk purely in terms of some kind of north-south divide, and you make it sound like the north is just one amorphous thing. And instead, it's when you're here on the ground and a part of it, you can feel it's not just one voice, it's a chorus, and that's the chorus that we want to reflect. People often say, oh, what is the north? What's your idea of the north? And we're very clear that it's not our job to state what that is. It comes through the writer's words, and it becomes an expression, a self sort of creating expression. So that is, it's our privilege to be that sort of bridge, and find those voices and reflect the amazing heritage, but also the really dynamic future that we feel that there is across the region, and to kind of revel in the lovely differences from, you know, the sort of urban metropolitan experience in the big cities of the north, and, you know, to also look at the rural life and the amazing landscapes and the things that feel like they're such a major part of the country. So despite that rather lengthy preamble, it's actually, you know, a simple mission, I feel. It's, there are sort of three big groups of people we want to talk to, and that is, you know, to mainly, of course, readers, because ultimately we're here not just to publish writing and stories, but to get those books into the hands of readers. And that's very much in all formats, however people want to find our books, in libraries, in bookshops, whether they're e-readers, they're physical readers, whether they love an audio book. It's reaching readers and growing readerships, because we're nothing as an industry unless we keep promoting books and the value they can bring, and turning people into readers, turning them into lifelong readers, celebrating people finding that love of literature at all points in their life and at all places. So we want to reach readers, yes, but we also want to kind of talk a bit about the business. And so part of the reason why we really wanted an office, which of course sadly is still lying closed at the moment, but is there waiting for us in Piccadilly in Manchester, was that sense of visibility and explaining the industry to people. I think publishing has sometimes been a bit of an ivory tower, and not found natural ways to have a conversation about how the business works, why decisions get made, and kind of that sense of visibility of all the different roles there are in it. You go back to those old sort of truisms. They say it takes a village to raise a child. I think it takes a village to publish. You know, you have that talent we talked about from you, the writer, and going to that solo reader, but in between there's so many different roles of people who work away to make those books the very best books they can be. So we wanted to reach those people and show them that there are jobs, and you can have jobs in the north as well. You don't have to move to London if you want to work in publishing. But today it's probably the third strand of working with writers that we wanted to talk a little bit about. And for us, it's very important that that's finding amazing new voices and discovering those incredible debuts and bringing those voices to the page, but also promoting and growing existing authors, and really kind of making sure we're sort of working with writers in a career building way, and connecting up all those groups. And of course that will mean all sorts of things. It will mean our work with our rights team to take those voices internationally. It will mean working with all the different retailers, as we said, from the big high street names and the supermarkets, to all the online platforms, and of course those key relationships with indie booksellers that have actually worked so hard through lockdown and have really been thriving, but on the back of such immense hard work. So it's building all of those relationships, and it's felt hugely lucky to be dreaming about publishing these stories since we opened in the summer, and then actually reaching a stage now where that is round the corner. I think we'll talk a little bit more about our sort of dream submission, but just to kind of set out that broad thing of what we're looking for. It's adult fiction and non-fiction for now. We wanted to start with a kind of confidence for the books that we know we can publish and a clear vision. We're also very lucky to have Hachette have started having a children's editor-at-large, Emma Layfield, and that Children's Books North movement that's growing. So we know there are people catering for fantastic children's writing across the region. Of course, all publishers never say never, where they might want to expand into a future point. But for now, it is fiction and non-fiction. But of course, it's quite a broad church within that. There are all kinds of things that are coming on the HarperCollins, the HarperNorth list, I should say. Sort of fiction ranges from amazing rom-coms. We've got a brilliant ghost story coming up, and a lot of sort of exciting voices on the non-fiction list. Memoir, sports, nature writing. So it's a really broad church, and every editor will write a wish list of the things they'd like to publish, and then immediately the next week they'll go out and buy something completely different because you fall in love with a voice and a vision for a story and how to share it. So we are encouraging all kinds of writers to come and talk to us. And I'm going to hand you over to Alice to talk a little bit about how we work with those authors and what we've done so far and our plans for the exciting years to come.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, I'm Alice Murphy-Pyle. I'm heading up marketing and publicity for HarperNorth. So like Jen, I worked for many years in London and then decided that a move outside would be better. So I'm originally from Stalybridge, which is just outside Manchester, and I've moved back to Manchester to work with HarperNorth. I could have stayed at home because I haven't actually been into the office yet since I started in June, but it's been nevertheless really, really exciting, and every day has been different. So in some ways we've been very, very fortunate because most of our publishing will be coming towards the end of 2021 and into 2022 and 2023. So in terms of kind of how we're going to work with authors, so to date we've published 2 titles. The first was Believers, which was by the independent chief football writer Melissa Reddy, which was about Liverpool FC's season. We published that in November, and then at the end of December we published a book by the motivational coach Paul Mort, who is a speaker and the coach from South Shields, and that's about men's mental health and about kind of achieving goals really when things are really difficult. So he's a man who has had a really varied but interesting life. So he was bipolar, and he's kind of very, very much a self-starter. We published him at the end of December, and that has been absolutely fantastic. And because of the readership, because it's aimed at men in their 20s and 30s, it's not a hugely book buying audience in the traditional sense. So we published that as an audio only project. And one of the things that's really exciting for us is that we are able to be nimble and look at each publication in terms of what is best for that. So our default will be that every single one of our books will publish in physical copy and in audio and in ebook as well, but we're able to kind of push a few projects through quicker. So we were never tasked with publishing anything at all this year, but we've been very very lucky to have a couple of things that we just couldn't turn down. And the things that we're looking for in authors, so far we've signed up 18 authors. We've announced 2. We've got another announcement coming this week, which is really exciting, which is a gangland crime thriller from a really, really remarkable author. And then coming into autumn, we'll have some, bigger non-fiction that will probably be slightly more mainstream. But the things we're looking for in authors is the ability to be a self-starter. So, our authors don't have to have huge social followings of their own, but it's really good if they do have an audience that they're able to speak to. So my advice would be, even if you have a small presence, to maybe think about launching a newsletter or some way of kind of building your audience. And then my job really is to work with the authors who we've signed up and make sure that they feel confident in the way that they speak to their readers. And also I feel very lucky because I'm looking after both publicity and marketing. I come from a marketing background myself, so I've worked in marketing for 10 years, and this is the first time I've done publicity, and it's been a real privilege to start something new and to expand that in my career. So making sure that we have news angles around each author has been a challenge for me, but it's been really, really exciting. And I think, you know, the ability to speak to readers in a way that is engaging with them is really, really important. So what we would be looking for is somebody who, you know, has that openness to talk to their following, and we can support in whatever way is best. So the two projects we've done so far have both been non-fiction, for the very straightforward reason that we went into lockdown before we hired a fiction commissioner. So Jen has very bravely acquired some fiction as well as being our publishing director, but we do have the majority of our upcoming publishing being non-fiction. But I think in terms of the fiction authors, we would like the ability to speak to readers, and just an awareness of who they are is really, really key, and we can support and help with the rest with our upcoming publishing.
Well, thanks. I think it's that chance to talk about our future plans is really exciting. I think it's sometimes publishing lead times can seem very slow, but for us, it's great to have that time to really build those relationships with retailers, to work with writers to make sure they feel that the book is obviously the very best it can be, and to get that sense of positioning. I know part of the things we talked about might be useful to discuss today is that sense of, you know, what is a book for HarperNorth? Do we have strict criteria? And people do often ask us, you know, sort of, am I northern enough? And obviously we're very keen to kind of celebrate the region without descending into cliche. And we always say to writers, no, you don't have to show us your council tax bill. It's not a kind of strict geographical demarcation. The shorthand we use when we're talking to agents and to colleagues in house is sort of either writers of, from, or for the North, is the way we kind of think about it. We talk about being from the North. Obviously, if the region's had a shaping influence on you, it's where you grew up. But writers who might now have gone to the Four Winds, because we know that Northern diaspora is a huge community. Equally, very much of the North. We've got some amazing writers coming up who weren't necessarily born or raised here, but this is their home. This is where they're writing from. This is their base. And then when we talk about books for the North, it's quite a broad category. Sometimes we've got some fantastic titles that are exploring issues that feel particularly pertinent socially, politically, culturally, historically, or also, you know, some amazing fiction that is just rooted either in a place, a character, or something kind of it comes of the land. So it's quite a broad remit, and we would always say, just ask us. You know, we'd always rather read something than not. And I know when we started up, there were some people saying, oh, you know, writers have already got enough roots. You know, are you going to find the books that you believe in? Are you going to find books of the right caliber? And well, what I always say is our greatest challenge at the moment has literally been keeping up with stuff, because we have seen so many amazing manuscripts, and we know there are even more out there. I don't know if anyone here will have had a look at our website, and we do have that open submissions channel, which is very important to us. We know some people are not yet agented. Some people prefer to go solo and don't want to go the agent route. Other people might be sort of somewhere else on their career pathway. So we wanted to have that open channel, and it's been wonderful, and we found some fantastic books through that. The only problem has been just getting back to people as quickly as we'd like. Part of that is obviously a symptom of lockdown, and I think when we're all not under the deluge of emails, I'd hope we'd be able to be swifter still. But it's important to us that that's an integral part of our business. We will close the open submission windows at points, but we've always said we'll tell people when it's closing, and then we'll say it's reopening. It won't be a kind of on the never. We want that pipeline to stay open. But equally, we want there to be a place just to ask questions, and we've got an address on our website for those sort of odd queries when you just think either what's a publisher talking about, or my book's kind of in an area that's not covered by something you've already talked about. So there's always a way just to get hold of us and talk about things like that. So I would always say just ask us questions, even if we are slightly more remote than we'd like to be at the moment. And hopefully, you know, in a world when festivals are back and we're back on doing road shows and back in those sort of events, we'll be able to have these conversations face to face. So I feel like everything for now is the beginning, but hopefully the beginning of something really rather special. I don't know if you wanted to talk about some of the other questions that we've seen already, Alice.
Yeah, the only thing I would add before we move on to questions is one of the things that we are really keen to do is to kind of slightly break down some of the perceived barriers around publishing and demystifying the industry. So we have an email address which is hello@harpernorth.co.uk. So if anybody has any questions, and it could be what does a B format paperback look like, or it could be how do I get a job in publishing, we do have that open channel, so you can either reach us via hello@harpernorth.co.uk. Also on Twitter we are @HarperNorth, and we have open DMs, and we do have Q&A sessions, but we haven't had one recently. But if anybody has any further questions, do feel free to contact us via those channels. We are aware that publishing can seem like a closed industry, so we're trying to kind of be as open as possible and as honest and direct as possible as well, because I think that in the long term is better for all.
No, I think that's something that we'll always aim to do, but also we're aware that, you know, everyone ends up speaking in jargon, so we're quite happy to be called out on it. And I think that's something we've talked about today when we're looking at some of the early questions, talking about, you know, how big is a novel, sort of thing, and these sort of questions that are really legitimate questions. And of course, there's no perfect answer to that. And what you tend to always talk about is the laws of averages, and say, you know, we're talking about something like 90,000 words for a normal novel, but you know, we see lots of submissions coming in at sort of 75,000. I've edited plenty of brilliant blockbuster chunky reads that push up 120, 150,000 words. So I would always think that the primary thing you keep in your mind, so I'm sure you'll do, is the story. The story is king here, and there's a generally a length and a format and a size that's appropriate. And also, you know, editors love to wield a red pen, so I would make sure the story is right before sort of worrying too much about word count. But yeah, equally, when something comes in at sort of 50,000 words, we know that's hitting a different category. Of course, it's a very different kettle of fish when you come to non-fiction, and I think, you know, you look at some of those really sort of accessible gift books that are really text light, but perhaps led by an amazing idea or something that speaks to a current trend. Or we've got an absolutely amazing landmark, History of the North, coming up. And of course, that's a big book because it feels like a milestone read, and like that we'll have a sort of a right length that does justice to what they're covering. But those kind of questions, we're absolutely always open to us. So please find a way to shout at us, and we can hopefully answer lots of those points.
For sure. Shall we move on to these questions? So I think we can whip through the questions that we had in advance. Thank you to everybody who sent those. That's really, really useful, not least because we're working from home. So sometimes we get a few tiny invaders. So the first one was from somebody who is a playwright who said they'd like to ask if we accept play submissions. And we're not accepting plays just because there are other publishers that publish plays better than we could. So we're not specialists in plays or poetry or sci-fi, for example. So they're areas that we're not accepting. And I think it's really important to us in building our culture to make sure that we're not kind of stepping on anybody else's toes. And we know that there's such a flourishing culture in the North of other publishers who have been here for a long time. So we're quite clear about what we publish and what we're going to step aside from, just because it's not quite right for us. And on our website, we've got some submission guidelines for the areas that we're not currently accepting submissions in, which isn't to say that there's no merit to them, just that it's not quite right for us as a trade publisher right now. And then, Jen, the second question is, what are the geographical criteria for HarperNorth? Do authors have to live in the North, be from the North, or set their books there?
No, I think as I say, I touched on earlier, we try and keep it as broad as possible. I certainly have certainly thought sometimes it feels a bit like a joker in the pack, but we talk about a northern mindset, it's certainly an attitude, we feel, a state of mind as much as a piece of geography, and for all those writers that feel outside that pull of London, and that the way sometimes you might be a writer based in the Midlands, but sometimes London can feel a world away culturally and economically and demographically. And we want to be a broad church. So if you think you might fit the bill, please get in touch without worrying about your altitude. And we do say, of course, every country has its north, and we have looked at international writers who again fall out of maybe that main sort of the main cultural drag of different countries' capitals, and writers who are perhaps marginalized voices and people and places and stories that feel like they might not have had enough oxygen and are looking for room. And I think as part of that, actually, I wanted to touch on something that someone had raised in a question, talking about the age when you might get your debut deal. And it's something that there are many issues in publishing, and we've talked about areas where we perhaps don't reflect enough diversity and things we want to change. But one thing that I really hold dear is the fact that there is no right time for your first deal. You can be at any point in your life, and we've published amazing writers as a company, and in my previous in roles at my previous publishers, writers who are really just starting out and come with an amazing freshness and innovative ideas. And equally, it's always really inspiring when you get submissions from people who come with a huge amount of life experience and fascinating stories. I'm reading a manuscript at the moment that I'm absolutely loving, and I know the writer, she's in her early 70s, and it's one of the things about publishing that you don't need, despite lots of preconceptions. You definitely don't need an old school tie. You don't need to be bought over a sort of dinner party at Bloomsbury on a Saturday night, especially not now. And you don't need to be a bright young thing. You just need to have a story to tell and a voice to tell it. And that is our privilege, to be able to open up a manuscript and it stands on the words alone. So we definitely don't feel that you have to be, you tick certain boxes. You don't have to be, you don't have to have a certain track record. I know there are so many writers who have a developing career, and the stories you want to tell and the books you want to write change during your career. And I think that's something that the industry is much more open to now. If you start writing in one genre, you don't have to stay in that genre. Obviously, there are countless authors who have amazingly diverse careers, but of course, also these days, often that sense of a portfolio career with perhaps writing under different names, different initials. So I think as a publisher, we're very keen to be flexible. And if people say, oh, well, I did this and, that was right for the moment, but now I'm interested in this, we'd love to hear about it. And I think there is that sense of every story has its time, and there's perhaps a reason why that manuscript in your bottom drawer wasn't right when you either were working on it before, or sometimes, we go back and we revisit books and think, okay, now this actually feels the right time. Is it a time to republish it? So we're really open to having those conversations. So do get in touch if you've got a story you think, okay, I think it might be now.
There's another question as well, which is leading on quite nicely, which is whether we're interested in authors who've previously published with an indie press but don't have an agent, which is kind of two separate things, really.
Yeah, but I think actually when I look at this list of, and we were only saying we were chatting to an author on Zoom just before this, and saying how much we wish we could get these amazing writers together at the moment, because it's a really diverse crew of authors. And and yeah, I think we've probably got the full range. You know, we've got writers who have self-published previously. We've got writers who've published with indie presses. We've got debut writers who've had their whole career with one agent, writers who've changed agents, writers who aren't agented. So I think there's definitely no constraints there at all. And I think also it kind of depends the genre you're writing in. And I think, you know, certain writers are, you know, sort of more likely to benefit from having that sort of expertise around them, and other writers are already, you know, very far on that journey and perhaps not in the space where they work with an agent. We also work with lots of non-traditional agents. So they might be talent agents or authors who come from a different sort of background. So we have conversations with all kinds of people, and I think the conversation is key. And I think actually there was another question that came in early talking about sort of subcategories and specifically the sort of mind, body, spirit area, which is, I think, a good example actually when you think of it, such a broad category, going from health and wellness to well-being and mental health. And I think there are going to be books on our list that will reflect parts of that category, but usually ones that have got that sort of that mainstream appeal. And I think that's probably how we define why us rather than the specialist publisher. We're looking for books that will sit really comfortably with a mainstream audience, that will be at home on the shelves in Waterstones, that will race up the charts on Amazon. So that sense of accessibility and a sense of inviting readers in. And of course, we've also got other parts of HarperCollins. We do share. We are, I will admit, slightly competitive, and we're always happy to talk to authors. You know, there are times when we might be bidding against a different part of HarperCollins and have a strong vision why us and why HarperNorth. But equally, there are times when something comes in and we think this is fantastic, but it doesn't quite fit the HarperNorth brief, and we will talk to our colleagues in fiction, in non-fiction, and then we do have the Thorson's list and Harper Inspire, which covers more, sort of goes into some sort of Christian publishing and other kinds of well-being publishing. So we will if we see something that's a real gem, but we don't think we're the perfect home for it, we'd always rather share it with a colleague than just say no, not for us.
And do people have to have completed the whole novel before submitting?
It's tricky, isn't it? And I'm sure, you know, again, writers do this every which way. I think in fiction, it's lovely to have the whole thing. I will often talk about my own personal. People say, you know, why do you buy the titles you buy? And of course, it's the voice, it's the character, it's the setting. But for me, the thing that I always say, it's not just how you begin, it's how you end. And that is the real magic. And I think those amazing word of mouth bestsellers, those ones that people really press into each other's hands. Yes, they often have amazing premises. They often have great hooks, but it's more about how they leave you. And I think if a book that delivers on an ending, is often the one that really, really stays with you. So I do think on the fiction side, it is useful to see that whole thing. You know, when it's our first time with an author, I think obviously that changes as you build that repeating pattern of publication, as hopefully an author moves into that sort of brand section where people know what to expect from a writer. So that can change. But early doors, you know, I love a whole manuscript. I think where that is different probably is on the non-fiction side, because so much of that is done on synopsis and chapter plan. And again, I think we've got a little bit on our website talking about some of the easiest ways to present your non-fiction idea.
Somebody else has said, why don't we consider novels of fewer than 80,000 words, particularly because people's attention spans are much shorter now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And actually, to be honest, publishing is a lot more open to these kind of innovations than it used to be. And part of that is the sort of changes in technology and platform. We're not stuck to the very old roots of printing certain volumes through certain printers. There are, of course, you know, the sort of basics of P&Ls and what works financially and what retailers are looking for, because a lot of the time we will be working very closely with booksellers. But I think ebooks especially have opened up a space where sometimes you think, okay, what is this? Is it novella? Is it novel? Is it part of a series of short stories? So I think you often see lots of that innovation in the ebook sphere. Other times, sometimes you read something and you think, this is beautiful, and I want more of it. And if something's, you might go and have that conversation with the writer about whether perhaps there's more to see, and you just want that story to breathe and reach that sort of more traditional novel length. So I would never say never, but sometimes it's about that speed of getting your book on the shelves and in a way that readers and retailers are used to. So I think there's a space for that sort of traditional fiction, and there's a space for innovation and the more sort of avant-garde and literary experimentation.
And speaking about jargon, do you want to explain what P&L is?
P&L, yes. I think, and actually, no, I think that's a good question, because when we talk about P&Ls or, say profit and loss, it's really important actually we often talk about the beauty of the story and our passion for publishing. But one of the reasons I think publishing is here is because it's that strange place where art meets business, and it's doing writers a disservice to pretend we're not trying to make successful careers and make financially viable books and build a useful business enterprise. So there is always a look at the numbers, and that can be the numbers in terms of the production side. How much is it going to cost to make this beautiful object or to record this fantastic audiobook? And it is important that we bear those in mind and kind of are open about the financial model and explain to authors and agents why an offer is where it is, or the fine print in the contract. And it's if we only talk about the books we fall in love with and not how we're going to sell them, then we're not doing the full end to end of publishing.
And then somebody had asked about the books that we have published or books that are in the pipeline. So as I say, we've published 2 so far, one in hardback and one in audio. We haven't actually announced any more, so this is all exclusive. So we're about to announce that we've signed up a gangland thriller author who is a remarkable writer, an incredible woman, and she struggled with reading and writing until she was 39. So she left school at 14, pregnant with no qualifications, and then ended up going on to an adult literacy course and just got the writing bug. And her book is remarkable. So it's called Tracks, and that will be out in July, and that will be our first fiction publication. And then we have one of the executive directors of the Youth Endowment Fund, who's written a book called Fractured, which is about societal cohesion and why it's really important to kind of look outside of your social bubble to find, people who are not like you, and why British society hasn't been doing that as much in recent years. And then looking towards Christmas, we've got one incredible book by a man called Professor Tony Redmond, who is currently heading up the Manchester Nightingale Hospital. He is a kind of disasters medic, and he's flown all around the world to war zones and to places where there have been earthquakes. He was first on the ground at Lockerbie, and as well as being a really, really moving and powerful medical memoir, he comes from the most abject poverty, and I think that's a book that will do really, really well this autumn, just because he's so unassuming, and he's got such an interesting story of his own life to tell. So that will be out in October. And then we also have a runner who ran the whole length of the Forrest Gump run, so 15,000 miles across America at various points. And he is an author who probably could have done with an edit before he handed it in, because he basically did this incredible feat and then wrote 450,000 words about his life and why he did it, and that has been edited down and continues to be edited. So he handed in 250,000 words, and that will be out in autumn as well. So it's a real mix of what we have coming, and as Jen says, we also have a kind of histories from prehistoric times of the North, which will be coming in May 2022. That's probably as much as I can say for now, but we've got lots more coming as well. And And there was another question as well about what's the rough percentage of non-fiction books commissioned from submissions received? Jen?
So I suppose it depends when we're thinking of unsolicited or agented submissions. As Alice said, at the moment, our opening list probably skews more towards non-fiction, but very much the idea is that we will be probably equal partners, fiction and non-fiction, once we've got our full sort of forward list coming up. So I would say that as it stands, probably our list say leans heavily towards non-fiction, but most of that non-fiction has come through 2 of the 3 channels, either from agents, and that, as I say, like I mentioned before, can be literary agents, talent agents, or different kinds of representation, or the other pillar of our publishing, which is direct approaches. And we spend a lot of our time talking about either people who lead extraordinary lives, but perhaps don't consider them to be extraordinary, and going directly and saying, I think you've got an astonishing story. Either people who've absolutely never been involved in the literary world before, or people who are perhaps journalists and writers from academia and other places, and saying, that there's a book in this. So that's how a lot of our non-fiction has come across. But we have had some fantastic non-fiction from the open channels as well, from the open submissions. And I think that first non-fiction via that channel, we're just, as publishers want to do, trying to decide the perfect slots, which will probably be early next year, Jan or Feb next year. But more of on the open submissions, that does skew more towards the fiction side. One thing we haven't done fully as yet, and I'm going to be fascinated to do, is a bit of a genre map to have a little look about where we've seen the biggest volume of submissions, because we also have a wish list. And this is something I often talk to people about, stuff like, I would love to find a book in this area or this genre. We've talked about big things we love: historical fiction, psychological thrillers, talking point books, books of place. I talked about a brilliant ghost story that I've already bought, but I think there's so much more to kind of mine and find in the North. And if I had one wish now, though, it would just be to kind of press pause and have a reading week. I think we need those in publishing. I could happily sit with these amazing submissions and turn off the emails and just dive into the books for a little bit longer.
We've had loads of questions submitted, so I just wanted to run through a couple of them before we finish, if that's
Sure.
okay with you, Alice and Jen. So I've cherry picked a few because we've had loads and loads in the chat, and it was, sorry to interrupt, it was just interesting. So one from Janet Dean, she asked, what proportion of books will you publish compared to how many that are pitched to you?
Oh, now that is a project we definitely should do. It's hard to say because the pitches come in so many forms, and obviously we keep kind of a track of the agented and the open submissions ones, so we know what we've been getting in. But all those ones that are pitched to us, because they can come in so many forms, and sometimes it can be a conversation, it can be a DM. So that probably takes the numbers up massively. But I think we should probably crunch the numbers to actually do it. I mean, in terms of our sort of scale initially, we'd always talked that we'd hope to publish around about 20 books in our first year, which is roughly where we're at. But because for us, that was always very much a starting point. And I hope that because publishing does have that sort of investment in the future, especially if you might be publishing in hardback first, you're already thinking, oh, well, there's my paperback for the year after then. And you're hoping that author's going to be sitting down and writing again. You've always got that sort of time's arrow into the future. So although we said, let's start with 20 books, I would like to see that going up and up, really. But yeah, unfortunately we have to say no to countless numbers of manuscripts, many more than we can publish. But I would hope we always try and say why. And that can be for a number of reasons. That sometimes the hardest reason to say no to something is when it is a good book, but you might just have bought something else a little bit too close to it on the list. And I think it really is important for the editor to say that and say, this is a great book, but it's just too close to something else. Or sometimes equally you can see something as strong, but if as an editor you don't have that vision for how to publish it, then you're not the right editor for it. If you can see that the writing's good and you know exactly where you'd like it to go, and you can see how you would sell it and position it, then you know you've got that vision for it. If sometimes you get the feeling it's good, but you can't picture how to do everything around it, then I think it's important to put your hands up and say you're probably not the right editor for it.
Thank you. There's a question from Helen Johnson, and she asks, how polished do you expect a manuscript to be if you get a direct author pitch? She's beta reading at the minute and finding that there are stories there, but they need cleaning up. Would you take a script that needs sharpening if there's a story there?
I mean, speaking personally, I always feel that what you need is one aspect to be the standout thing when you find it. And that is because obviously everyone's creative process is different. It's going to be slightly different. So for me, I think sometimes you read it and you think that plot is absolutely fantastic. It's compelling. It's there. It's engaging. There's some work to be done on the writing, and you think, okay, that's the job of the editor, is to do that, but to always be upfront and talk to the writer about it, because what I feel we should never do is take something on without making sure that the author is entirely on board. You don't want to. What you want to do is get the best face of the book facing out to the readers, not to change that book, but to make sure there's always that shared understanding and you share that vision for what the book could and should be. So I think if it's that, then you can work on the writing and there's scope to do that. Conversely, sometimes you just read a voice, you think this is beautiful, and the writing is there, but perhaps the plot and the structure is not right. And again, so then you can say, okay, that's probably going to be the work in the edit. Actual line by line, the beautiful prose is there. The smaller job sometimes is to say it needs sort of structural tweaks. Sometimes the harder conversations to have is talking about someone who's obviously a talent, but needs to have a little bit more room and conversation about what story they should be telling. And that's sometimes a longer game, but it's always a conversation worth having. Where I think both of those pieces still need a bit of extra work, that's when you're saying beta readers, hugely valuable. If you can see there's something there, but it hasn't got either that compulsive plot or the great writing yet, then it perhaps needs another round of revises. And it's hard. It's really hard letting go of your manuscript, and I never lose sight of the effort it takes, not just to complete a manuscript, but to then complete it and let go of it and to send it out into the world. But if you can, I mean, you really see the difference between those manuscripts that have had another pair of eyes on it. And then you're kind of ready to dive in.
Brilliant. Thank you. Perhaps a question for you, Alice, from Moira Hodgkinson. She says, if we have experience with public speaking and whatnot, is that worth mentioning in your pitch letter?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I'm probably not the world's greatest public speaker because I am quite a nervy person. But I think it's good to be able to hold a room. And I think if you don't have that, we can help and we can media train authors. I think if it's something that you're used to, so, not necessarily direct public speaking, even if you've been a teacher or if you are, used to talking to a group of people at, for example, a church is a fine example. That's a real benefit because we know then, okay, you could go and maybe do a library tour. So I think public speaking is a massively beneficial thing to have.
Brilliant. And one question to kind of flip it on its head, we're always talking about authors pitching to publishers, but Karen Featherston asks, what is the advantage of submitting to HarperNorth rather than the main HarperCollins brands? So I suppose it's kind of your guys' chance to pitch to us authors.
Absolutely. And I think this is the privilege. And for us, it was a sense of, it's a position I've never been in before in my sort of 20 odd years in publishing, is having the space, and that is a massive luxury. I've always before had a schedule filled with some amazing talent, but then sometimes you did have to feel, where am I going to find the perfect room for this? Where am I going to be able to make sure that someone's got that pathway as well, that something doesn't feel like a one-off? Certainly as a new imprint, you are really looking to invest in those career writers and feel that you can build something long term. So certainly I would say the space is a massive advantage. For authors in the North, I think hopefully it's also that we are trying to always look at all those sort of 3 levels of publishing, making sure we are maximizing your local audience and working very closely with regional booksellers. We're very lucky, obviously, to have Media City and other things on our doorstep. And so that sense of what you can do in terms of regional sales, regional publicity, regional marketing. But then also, because of being part of the broader HarperCollins family, you're part of that national scale. And of course, as well, is trying to maximize all those rights in as many territories as possible. So we've talked a little about rights and translation, but also about our work through Harper 360 of trying to make sure you're really maximizing on your American markets as well. So it's that sense of trying to be hand in glove. We're trying never to be just inward looking. We want all these books to go out and find the broadest possible readership, but the luxury of being hopefully on the ground to understand the roots of that story and to see where that trajectory might take it.
Brilliant. I think time for a final 2 or 3 questions that we've had in the chat. One from Julie Ibbotson. What genres are you particularly interested in for fiction?
Oh, it is tough, isn't it? I say at the moment, I always love a crime novel. Probably if I had to pick an area of crime I enjoy most, it's one that perhaps looks at the mystery from a different perspective. So I'm always interested when the investigator is perhaps coming at things from a slightly different angle. I love an armchair detective. I've been delighted to see the return of that sort of. I think people often used to put cozy crime as a sort of a category from a different era. Obviously, everyone's seen what Richard Osman can do when he does his thing. And I think there are lots and lots of amazing writers in this area. And I don't think of it as a sort of subcategory. I think of it as a sense of crime that's also looking at, say, often armchair detectives, but also looking at things in the round, and that sense of that feeling that we see actually in a lot of our fiction at the moment, people looking for a little bit of optimism and a little bit of hope. So some publishers talk about this category of sort of uplit as a genre, which again, I think is slightly awkward terminology, as always happens whenever you pigeonhole something, because fundamentally it's about the story and the characters. But I think there is a mood for books that give us hope. And I don't think that's books that have to be purely about the happy things, but that give us a sense of our shared humanity, books that are uniting us more than dividing us. So I think some of those sort of positive stories, there's a real hunger for. And then, I'm delighted that the growth of historical fiction is continuing. I think there are a lot of people out there who perhaps have an expertise in a period or have researched something. And there is people having not been able to move around at all this year. People are delighted to travel in time if they can't travel in place. So we're always looking for those great senses of place. And I think the North has got, not just amazing landscapes that are so spectacular. I would love a book that sort of is set against those against the environment of Whitby, and places like that are really dear to me. I think there's some fantastic writing coming out of the Lakes, and I can see more of that. So I think the sense of place doesn't have to just be a big city. I like those sense of sense of place. And then, like every other editor in town, I love a good premise, one of those talking points, those what if books. What I would say is when you're sort of talking about what your book is, and I'm sure many people have said it before, those one-line pitches are really useful. And I think sometimes people worry about them because they feel they're reductive. And of course, they are reductive because you're trying to do an amazing, complex, nuanced piece of art in one line. But what I always think of them is it's painting your front door a lovely colour, a bright colour. The rest of the house is still in there, but you make that front door be the one that people want to walk in through. And publishers might sometimes disagree with your one-liner. We might take it in a different way. We might, obviously always in conversation with the writer. But those what if starts are always a really exciting jumping off point.
Excellent. And then just one final question on the kind of practical thing. If someone was to submit to you today, this week, sort of, when would they expect to hear back from you?
Well, at the moment, we're trying to get back to people within 8 weeks. So we've our editorial assistant, Megan Jones, is doing a phenomenal job. We are still in startup mode, so we are a small team. So it is taking around 2 months to get back to people. So it's taken a little bit of time, but we're partly because we're trying to give each submission the space it needs. We need to have time to read it and to talk about it between one another and speak to our sales team. And it's really important not to just read one page and then say this is not for us. We have to give each one the consideration and the respect that it deserves. So 8 weeks. So if you submitted it today, you might hear something by the end of March. We've just closed our submission window for a month to give us time to catch up, because we had not so many non-fiction submissions, but we had a lot of fiction. And that, as Jen says, that ending is all important. So we needed to make sure we'd read them.
And I think also it's one thing to say sometimes the trickiest ones you can spend the longest time with are the ones that you can tell there's something here and you want to find the route through, and that sometimes means either some honing work, or it often means sort of working on the pitch and the positioning and making sure you can win sales and marketing and rights and everyone over. And they're often the hardest ones to let go when you think this writer's got something, and sometimes that book isn't quite there. But sometimes you really need to prise it back out of the editor's hands, because you're like, it's nearly there. But you end up having longer conversations, of course, about those ones. The ones that are more straightforward yeses and nos move faster than those might be, maybe, I could see where this could go. But yeah, I kind of appreciate how hard it is waiting for responses, especially in these remote working times when everything is perhaps a little bit more treacly than we might like it to be in terms of speed.
So if you haven't heard yet, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We'll take that.
No, absolutely. But also, what I would say, and I say this to people in all areas of life, is we're not averse to a prod. People often think, am I being pushy, or should I, if you can always drop us a line. There have been days when people have said, things have just got lost into the terrifying amount of emails people send and receive now, that almost every conversation has to be an email, apart from these luxurious few video calls. So things, if you're worried something has fallen, into the sea of digital comms or down the back of the virtual sofa, just do give us a prod and ask why, or tell us what you're up to. So we're not averse to that, and we are trying to move faster and swifter. And as I say, if we could have a time turner and spend a little bit more time reading, we would love that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing so much information and your wisdom and knowledge, your insights. There's been so many lovely comments in the chat, and lots of questions. Sorry to anybody that we didn't get around to their questions, but we will be sharing a copy of this recording. So if you missed anything, you can catch up. And Alice and Jen have said we can share details of their Twitter and the email address that you can get in touch with any questions that you might have after this session. But thank you so much once again. That was brilliant. We will be hosting a Zoom informal session right now. Sorry, we've overrun for a few minutes, but I don't want to cut you off. So we'll post a link at the top of the chat there if you want to join us. Jen and Alice won't be with us, but we'll just be having an informal chat amongst authors. So thank you so much, and I'll end the event there. Take care.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.